We are on to the final, this reflection in my glass. Okay, we are on to our final um, lecture for week 4 on neuroethics. So this lecture is on Mary Jean Walker and Catriona Mackenzie's Neurotechnology's Relational Autonomy and Authenticity. So the approach in this article is the authors are going to first develop a theory of authenticity and then apply it to neurotechnologies, right? Instead of sort of working with just a sort of nebulous account or just sort of a briefly defined account of what authenticity is in the first place. Um, Now, as a first stab, authenticity means something like being true to yourself or acting on motives, desires, preferences, and other reasons for action that are your own, right, as opposed to someone else's. So, I mean, if it is true that neurotechnologies affect authenticity, and if it's true that authenticity is something we value, then that would give us reason to be concerned about, right, the ethics of neurotechnology. And Walker accepts um, what some other authors have said, which is that what is really at the core of the worry about authenticity is a worry about autonomy, right, and how this interacts with the concept of personal identity. So they're going to spend some time sorting out these conceptual issues, right? This relation between authenticity, autonomy, what these various things could be. And once that's established, or at least they've done a bit more work on it and argued for a particular account, they think that will help clarify then our intuitions about ethics of neurotechnology. So just sort of as background, what is the effects of neurotechnologies on authenticity? Well, some people have, and we've seen in the previous lecture, in some cases it seems like maybe it increases your authenticity, right? So if you think of um, depression or other mental disorders as sort of clouding or hiding the real self, then you might think that interventions which help depression or other again mental disorders, um, they sort of remove that and allow you sort of access to your true self, right? Um, but how much of that is true and how much of that is marketing? Some people we saw in the last article that at least that one subject they interviewed who had an implant, right, did seem to feel more himself, right, thanks to that intervention. But other people have reported the opposite, right, where some people say it makes them feel less like themselves, and they sort of offer a quote from the other perspective. Um, His moodiness and irritability were comfortable to him because they represented his legitimate suffering and rage. On Prozac, Philip felt better than well, and he hated it. He had been prematurely robbed of his disdain, his hatred, his alienation. He felt phony and did not trust himself. So the idea is, just as there's people who feel that, yes, this is my true self, finally I'm free of this burden, other people feel like, no, the burden was kind of part of me, right? Part of my feelings of sadness or rage or whatever were legitimate. They had a reason, and I was uh, I wanted to hold on to them, right? You can have reasons to be angry or to feel bad, and sometimes if um, sometimes you need to work through that on your own. So there seems to be, they think, two sides, and we need to do a little bit more work to determine whether neurotechnology has a positive or negative effect on authenticity. And we've seen, results for deep brain stimulation, right? When you are freed, right, or you have a bit more control over whether and when you have seizures, um, some people report that they feel more like themselves, but some, according to them, report that they feel less so. Um, I think, and one even sort of deeper problem, right, that even regardless of what people report about how they feel, um, there's also the issue of whether the feeling of authenticity reflects any actual authenticity, right? Maybe there's a objective criteria of whether you are authentic, and those may or may not include feeling authentic, right? So here are four sort of potential issues, right, with the effect of neurotechnologies on authenticity, and they're going to sort of discuss them one by one. So one, this might be a problematic method of personal change. Two, it might encourage quietism, and we'll explain what quietism means. Three, it might encourage conformism. And four, it might involve a loss related to a respect for the given. We'll explain all these in much more detail. These are the four issues that we're going to consider before they go on to then develop an account of what they think autonomy and authenticity are, and then they're going to review those four things sort of in the light of what they think the best account. Right. Okay. Number one. So neurotechnology is seen by some as a problematic form of change because it doesn't involve the sort of personal effort that education and psychotherapy involve. This is very much right that we've seen this over and over, the no pain, no gain idea. So the passivity of an implant is somehow sort of less meaningful than sort of, I don't know, I guess conquering the issue yourself or using much more effort. Um, so because there's not the same emotional growth and self-knowledge that's involved in sort of the slower, more old-fashioned therapies, some people argue the person can't fully own the change. So they're in many ways improved, but somehow they can't like own that improvement as their own. Um, Number two, the concern about quietism. This is the idea that maybe it's not good to be sort of happy or calm all the time. Right? So you take Prozac and all of your bad feelings go away and you just feel sort of nice and steady all the time. Um, is that necessarily a good thing, right? So this is the Soma, right? This is if you ever read Brave New World, right? Um, it's sort of a futuristic horror story of people who take this drug Soma and feel happy and fine all the time, but they're not fine. Right? At least that's the idea of that story, and that might be the issue with quietism, right? Some situations um, call for us to be sad or anxious, right? There's good reasons, and it's right to be sad and anxious. So if drugs mean you can't react authentically to situations that demand those kinds of emotions, and instead you're just always calm and happy, that's what they mean by quietism. And that could you can see how that could be a bad thing. All right, number three. Sometimes dysfunctional personality traits are just ones that make it harder to be a worker or subject to social norms. So this is the concern of conformity, right? Um, so what we don't want, right, is neurotechnology to be intervening on you just to make you sort of more productive or complain less about being overworked, right? Or conforming to very arbitrary social norms, dressing in whatever, less quieter earth tones and like not wearing the crazy hat that you like. Um, that doesn't mean that you're crazy or necessarily or need or have some sort of problem that needs to be fixed, right? Sometimes you just want to be yourself. So if these neurotechnological interventions are primarily or to some objectionable degree aimed at just sort of like pushing you into a mold, that's probably not good either. Number four, some find a value in simply accepting what occurs naturally, right? So this is the given that they're talking about, rather than attempting to manipulate nature to our preferences. So you might say there's just a value in sort of the gifts you were given, right, by nature or God or whatever, and you shouldn't be attempting to manipulate your psychology into being something different. So, okay, so those are four issues you might have, right? And these are sort of the idea is these are sort of objective criteria, right? So whether or not you feel more authentic, you might fail on one of these four criteria, which they take to be somewhat more objective. Um, so they're going to focus now on a philosophical analysis of authenticity as an objective phenomenon, and then once they've set that up, decide if these four issues are going to be problems or not. So what is authenticity anyway? So Walker and colleague argue that authenticity it has its roots in a concept of being true to oneself, which actually predates sort of modern times, we think of it as sort of being true to yourself in a sort of internal relation, but actually it's older than that. And originally it was um, authenticity meant being true to some sort of external relationship, like your relationship with God, or fulfilling your role in society, or your place in the universe. Right? And then more recently, this sort of external relation has sort of fallen away, and authenticity has become this more atomistic sort of concept where it's like just me and myself, and what is my true self, and am I being true to me? It doesn't seem to want to have anything to do with society or God or the universe or anything like that. Those are more often seen actually as impediments to authenticity, right? Oh, my mom and dad are trying to make me be whatever, a doctor, an engineer, but I want to be true to myself and be a rock star, that kind of thing. So given this sort of background, this history, there's they uh, sort of claim there's about three important ways that people have developed different accounts of authenticity, which they call substantive, non-substantive, and existential accounts. And right now we're going to explain what those mean. So substantive authenticity. So one example they take is Rousseau. I don't know if you ever read Rousseau in any of your courses, but Rousseau thinks that being authentic involves aligning yourself with nature and just freeing yourself from the influence of society, right? Getting back to the land, back to nature. Here's Arnold Schwarzenegger being at one with nature. Uh, Another substantivist view, right? Another example of what a substantivist view of authenticity would be is Romanticism, which was sort of in the 1800s, I think, a sort of literary and philosophical movement um, that thought that your authentic self is accessed through sentiment, through your feelings, right? So you need to be able to be in touch with your feelings, be able to access them and express them, and that's your authentic self. So that's the substantive view, right? It says authenticity is sort of a relation to something real, either to getting right with nature or getting right with your own feelings. Now, the non-substantive account of authenticity is what we call a procedural view, right? So it just says, here's sort of some steps to tell if you're authentic or not. If you sort of pass this test, then you are. Um, so one of the tests is like, okay, say you do something, right? You have a belief or something, and you ask yourself, would I endorse, if I sit back and think and reflect on this sort of impulse I have or this belief I have, and I think after some reflection, would I endorse this as my own, right? Would I say this is my own? And if you would, then it's authentic. So, example, right? It's in a fit of anger, right? You're in a fight with your partner and you say something insulting, right, to them. You say, I never liked that dress anyways. I don't know. And then after you've calmed down a bit, you think to yourself, okay, is that really me? Do I really want to say that? Did I even really feel that? And if after reflection you say, actually, I want to apologize, I want to retract that. I actually do like the dress. I was just being mean. I was just trying to hurt you. Um, then you would say that that wasn't authentic to you, right? Um, Now, of course, some people sort of believe the opposite, right? So they say, no, it's when you're in your fit of anger or when you're drunk or whatever, when all your inhibitions are drunk down. That's the real you, right? These things you do unreflectively and when your guard is down. Um, so these are both procedural views, right? One says, sit, think reflectively, and decide if that's really you. The other says, get really wasted and whatever you do, that's really you. You know what I mean? Um, uh, there are probably parts of you that you don't like that much and would like to change, but still are you. So it gets very complicated, right? So they take the example of introducing yourself as an alcoholic at an AA meeting. Um, so that seems to be maybe it's not something you endorse. It's not something on reflection you would like to be or think that that's you, but you are sort of acknowledging it. But then again, maybe that is a form of endorsement, right? So it gets tricky, right? And they're not going to go too much further down this road. But the general idea is this is another sort of authenticity you might have. It's following some procedure, right? And they don't say exactly what that procedure would have to be. And finally, the existentialist views. So this is a picture of Camus. He's maybe the only philosopher that looks cool in a photo. He's an existentialist. So, anyways, on this view, the existentialist view, authenticity involves acknowledging your radical freedom and the lack of any constraints. So this is, I think, associated with Sartre and Camus. Um, so the idea is like once you understand the human situation, right, your place in the world, you realize I'm not beholden to anyone, right? I exist for a little while and then I go out of existence, um, and all of that just belongs to me. That's all I have, right? And that's what I am. I'm not, there's no God, right? I'm not acting right so that I'll go to heaven. There's nothing like that. I just do what I want. I'm totally free, right? I don't need to listen to my parents, right? And I don't even never necessarily need to pay attention to laws or whatever, right? So that's the sort of radical freedom that they're talking about. Um, and so you're literally creating yourself from scratch, right? You are whatever you want to be, right? Do it. So this view is, right, totally ignores anything outside you and your own experience, your own existence. So it's extremely atomistic. Um, Definitely borders on total ethical egoism. Sort of Nietzsche is associated with this well, beyond good and evil, right? So the idea is um, all morality maybe is just totally arbitrary. It's just a tool to sort of keep you in line, and you should just create your own morality. All right, so one more account of authenticity, and this is the one that they're going to favor. Um, This is authenticity in the social self, right? So these atomistic views, those other three, were all in some way atomistic, right? Either you're focusing in on your emotions, or you're following some procedure to determine whether what you just did was really you, or you're an existentialist and all you have is just sort of yourself at this moment in the world. Um, the social self sort of harkens back to the older version they were talking about, right? And they're saying, no, you are in part constituted by your relations to other people, right? That's what it is to be a person. We're social creatures, right? We're social animals. We evolve that way, and you can't really be a human or a self without having some relations to other people. Um, so, if you buy this kind of view, right, and it's plausible, right, it's just as plausible as any of the others. It might avoid some of the problems associated with the other three. Um, it allows some constraints on you, besides this radical atomic sort of individualism, and by situating you in an objective world with other people, it makes it possible that there could be some objective factors, right, as to what makes you authentic. It may not totally be up to you, right? Which is what they were looking for. They were looking for some objective way to figure out this authenticity issue, right? Okay. See, it makes sense, right, of how we can identify with parts of ourselves that we don't like or want to change. Um, so if part of yourself is sort of what's your relation to the social world, right, um, then you may not necessarily, some of that will be imposed on you. You may not necessarily agree with it, but it will be yourself, right? So there can be parts of yourself that you don't like. Um, so on this view, right, we're not radically free like the existentialists, and it's not, authenticity is not only just about your feelings, like the romantic, we're only accountable to nature, uh, and we're not only as yourself, your authentic self is not only associated with the parts you endorse, like the procedural view. Your authentic self is accountable to others, and in some parts is out of your control. Okay, so if we now let's think in terms of that social self that they kind of like. What does that have to do with neurotechnology, right? If we take on that view, does that help us sort out the ethics of neurotechnology at all? Well, let's return to the personal change concern. So is change mediated by technology less authentic than that mediated by sort of the traditional work real hard therapy and right self knowledge and stuff and all that, the no pain no gain deal? Um, well, they think to think that it would somehow technology would be less authentic is fairly atomistic, right? It's again, it's focusing on the self and saying, if I'm going to change, it has to be up to me. I have to be the one that makes it happen. Um, that's not necessarily true if you're a social self, right? So the changes might arise from sort of different patterns of social interaction that occur because of the medical intervention, right? So if you take take a pill and it makes you sort of less depressed and more friendly, and all of a sudden people act differently towards you. Well, since on the social view, yourself is partly defined by other people and how they treat you, then that can be perfectly authentic, right? Um, Again, it's not because the focus isn't solely on you, then the fact that you took a pill seems less important, right? Um, okay, the quietism concern. So, um, can on this social view, the good feelings that you have be authentic, right? As opposed to the bad ones that you used to have. Well, since on their view feelings aren't the source of your authenticity, they're not romantics. Um, that wouldn't really be a problem, right? Just because your feelings change doesn't mean that you are less authentic, because again, you are defined in large part by your social relations, right? Um, Now, there would be another sort of quietism concern that would arise on this new social view, which is that um, if this change in your sort of emotional states somehow keeps you from resisting certain oppressive or dysfunctional social pressures that are on you, right? So again, if you're defined by your social pressures, some of them will be good, some of them will be bad, um, and you'll still want to resist the bad social pressures that are on you. And if neurotechnologies reduce your ability to do that, then that would be a threat to authenticity, even on the social view. The conformism concern. Do neurotechnologies simply force you to conform to an ideal personality type? So the authors deny any essentialist notion of your personality, but they do say that authenticity would be threatened if the medication led people to accept reasons as valid due to social pressure when they otherwise would not do so. So maybe I need to read it again. Again, with these articles, you have to read them sort of over and over, and they seem new every time. You'll read it and you're like, wait, did I even say that part? But this part seems potentially problematic to me. Um, because conformism is a social thing, right? So, um, and the issue with conformism is this distinction between yourself and society, right? So, to conform is to, in some ways, right, take your true self and sort of change it to fit society, right? So, if they're saying yourself just is sort of defined by society, then it's not clear um, how they can get around the issue of conformism, right? Or conformism, I guess, might not even exist for them. Now, it's not clear. They do say there's sort of bad social pressures and good social pressures. But at any rate, this part was a little confusing for me. It seemed like maybe an interesting thing for area for a paper, right? There does seem to be, at least lurking in the background, a sort of tension between their idea that um, the self is defined socially and that there could be a concern about conformism, which again implies a distinction between the self. Not sure they have room to necessarily make that distinction, I guess is what I'm saying. And loss of respect for the given. So this concern, right, is that there's some sort of value in the way things are. We shouldn't monkey around with nature, right? Maybe you think it's the way God intended, or maybe you just think that humans just don't have the amount of wisdom that is required to be able to mess with nature. Um, But of course, the sort of social account of the self would deny there's any natural self to begin with. It's all socially constructed, right? Um, there certainly may be some value in the ability to accept things that you can't change, but on the social view, they claim there's no essential value in what exists merely because it was always that way. So, conclusion, the upshot is what they're arguing is whether neurotechnology threatens authenticity is going to depend on your account of what is authentic. And if that account changes, it doesn't automatically determine the answer one way or another, but it does change the answers on some particular points, changes the way we evaluate it. They did turn out getting some different answers, right, from a perspective of what counts as authenticity. So that is the final lecture for the neuroethics portion. Week 5 will be on to AI.